Hi, we're just waiting for Julian to switch on his audio.
Yes.
There we go.
Hello. Should I put the video on also?
No, you don't need the. You can
Okay.
put the video on as you wish. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Julian.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. So I will do a short introduction before leaving the space to the floor on some quick impact of the COVID-19 on retailers and consumers across Africa. Maybe let me start by what are the impacts so far, and I have highlighted on that slide the positive and the negative trends that we have seen. The first positive trend, let's start by some encouraging facts. You know, there is a clear acceleration of modern grocery retail so far. The reason for that is the modern retail provides a one-stop shop for most consumers who are looking for a wide range of products. The modern grocery retail shops are seen as providing better safety and protecting better the consumers when shopping from the COVID-19. And also the modern grocery retail, at least in some countries, are seen as being able to keep some price stability. What we've seen in modern retail in the latest numbers that Sagacity Research has been collecting as part of the different panels that we have, we've seen the March 2020 numbers 20%, 30% higher than in like-for-like, higher than the numbers in 2019. The reason for that is, so several reasons. One is consumers have been buying and stocking goods in preparation of the lockdowns. The only other impact that we see is also that modern retail has been taking a share of mouth, if I can say, from the food service, right? Since restaurants have been closing, so consumers still have to eat, and so they will buy whatever they have to eat. Instead of going to the restaurant, they will buy it from modern retail. So that's the first positive trend. The second trend that all of you, I guess, have been also experiencing is the sharp acceleration of e-commerce. Some examples here. So we saw supermarket chains developing online platforms overnight. An interesting fact, for example, is Tuskys in Kenya. They said that they were executing 3,000 orders per day for an average value of around $78, which is quite high, right? Much higher than the average value that they see on the stores. And also the 3,000 orders per day is quite impressive, taking into account the fact that prior to the COVID-19 lockdown, they used to do almost nothing or almost nothing. Yet on e-commerce, what we see is execution is still chaotic. We see consumers complaining of orders not being fulfilled, and so there is a lot of demand. Yet, you know, the supply is still to catch up. Obviously, here the existing online platforms, especially Jumia, for instance, in most of the African countries, are quite well positioned. They have the brand name, they have the awareness, so that consumers can go directly to them. In terms of numbers, so some numbers. So March 2020. Keep in mind that most of the lockdown started around mid-March. So there's a beginning of March which was more or less normal, and then the impact is essentially on the last 2 months, on the last 2 weeks. Sorry, but the numbers we have. So same thing. March 2020, like for like on e-commerce, an increase of 60-80%, and obviously even higher on some categories versus the same period, the same months of last year. What we see also is obviously other selected retail specialists also growing, pharmacies obviously, and we see a sharp increase in the pharmacy sales, and also the specialist food and wellness chains across the continent, which are benefiting from also an increase in modern grocery shopping, and also in the need for probably to eat better products. The negative impacts, and I'm sure the panel will be able to discuss further this Obviously, most of the line stores are being closed. The business collapsed, so it went straight to zero. What we see, a sector we are following very closely at Sagacity Research is food and beverage. So food and beverage are now running with limited deliveries only. And the issue is, in some countries, if I take Kenya as an example, is your deliveries can only happen essentially over lunchtime because of the curfew. Most of the, well, not most, all of the restaurants, they cannot deliver in the evening, right? So it means most of the food and beverage outlets are running on a very low capacity for the time being. In terms of numbers, so preliminary data we had for March, about 50% decline versus 2019. Again, the impact is mostly on the last week. I think on the first 2 weeks of March, there was already a decline, but the strongest was on the last 2 weeks. What to expect for April, and same thing, maybe we can have the discussion with the panel. Probably, a complete collapse of the sale, especially on food and beverage, moving to yeah, sorry, I don't know. So the slides moved. Moving to a 90% like-for-like decline. For malls, again, no footfall. Stores are closed. Whoever is coming, they go straight to the supermarket, and consumers avoiding closed and crowded spaces as per the government guidelines in most countries. So this results in footfall being down by 50 to 96% if we refer to the latest numbers that Google has published. I guess most of you are aware, but if not, Google has published some numbers in terms using Google Maps to see the footfall or where people were going or not going anymore. This is done by country and very insightful in being able to see the impact on retail specifically of this. If I move to the consumers, what are the impacts so far? So on consumer goods, FMCGs, the focus is on essentials. So a lot of consumption is currently being driven by food, especially fresh food and health-related products. You can imagine masks, sanitizers, gloves, and so on. Home care products are also working quite well. Everybody wants to make sure the house is clean of any germs. Interestingly, you could imagine that on drinks, the decline would not be too strong, but actually the decline on drinks is quite strong. The collapse of the out-of-home consumption is obviously not compensated by the in-home consumption, and so even the beverages manufacturers have seen quite a sharp decline. What we see from a consumer standpoint is consumers switching their expenditures to digital content, which is skyrocketing. Obviously, entertainment. Obviously, also all the online gym training, online classes for kids. An interesting fact here is the providers, the internet providers, are actually struggling to keep with the uptake in demand. They are running out of routers. And they are struggling to make sure all the households are being equipped. Other category which are experiencing high demand, the leisure equipment, especially the leisure that you can do at home. So here I put the IT, obviously IT electronic equipment, laptops, printers, and so on. The home leisure sports categories. So that everybody can exercise at home, and also some interesting categories around home equipment. For example, one of the fastest growing category, so this was not in Africa, but around the globe, was on, for example, bread makers, where people, they have to eat bread, so they make bread themselves instead of going out to buy it. What we see is discretionary spending collapsing. Beauty, for instance, which is also a category we follow closely. Where obviously people are not willing to spend on beauty. They're willing to spend on personal care, right? But not on beauty. And this is a category which has been deeply hit. Cars, obviously, where no one wants to buy cars in that situation. Travel and other categories. our view on this is obviously the collapse is likely to be long-lasting. When you put together the effect of the current situation, the fact that a lot of people will see their income decline, or most people will see their income decline, obviously the discretionary spending is not going to be the first category that people start spending on, and the impact are likely to be much longer. Interestingly, what we see is also a fast growth in mobile transaction, which becomes the preferred mode of transaction when consumers avoid a cash and card transaction. They move to mobile transaction. In Kenya, most of the transaction are done whether online but also outside, are now done, and M-Pesa is doing a good job to make sure everybody uses M-Pesa instead of cash and card. So in a nutshell, this is a summary of the impact that we see so far. We are still obviously in the very early phases of the impact, and so we don't see all of the impact, whether it's on retail and consumers. I guess now part of the panel discussion, we will go into better understanding what can be probably the long-lasting impact, and especially what can be the reactions of retailers and mall developers to face that situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. We'll now move on to the panel discussion. So I'll ask the panelists to please switch on your audio and video, and then we'll move straight on to the panel. So I'm going to hand over to Kevin. And thank you, Julian, once again, and we look forward to the panel discussion now.
I see some questions from the participants on the slide. I guess I'm fine on my side to share the slide with the participants.
Okay, perfect. We appreciate that. Thank you.
Sorry, everyone. It seems the video doesn't seem to be on. Strangely, it was working just now. I'm going to try to fix it, but let's start. Yeah. So that black screen on the right is me, by the way. So great to have you all. We've got a great panel here, which represents East Africa and also West Africa, being a Francophone and Anglophone Africa as well. And I guess, Kafir, you've already made the introduction in terms of who's on the panel. I'm going to go straight into the questions without wasting too much time. I hope everybody can hear us. It's great to use technology, and apologies for yesterday. I think we're still teething and fine-tuning, and the days of Star Trek is actually in front of us. Yeah, what we're going through, I remember 30 years ago, loved to see it in Star Trek, and never thought I would experience it. But we're actually talking to the panelists who are in different parts of Africa, so which is great, which says basically Africa is connected technologically. And then we have hundreds, if not 300 or 400 of viewers in Africa, but also globally who've tuned in. So it's all fantastic. I'm going to get into the question. I'm going to start probably with West Africa. I would love to know, Sheikh, I mean, you're based in Abidjan. You travel extensively to places like Dakar and Accra and Lagos. Can you just give us, maybe to start, what's happening in your market? Like, when have you started lockdown, and where are you in the COVID-19 cycle? Maybe a 1-minute intro, yeah?
Sure, thanks, and good morning, everybody. So as most of you have seen and know, Africa is basically lagging about a month or two behind the global trends that you see in the epidemics. And basically, we're far from what will likely be the peak of the virus. So for most of these markets, 3 weeks ago is really where things started to get serious. Most markets have had a range of measures from almost total confinement in Nigeria to semi-confinement in Ivory Coast, where there's a curfew and people can still go out and about during the day, although non-essential businesses, I suppose, and retail are supposed to be closed. And most of the formal sector is working from home. Another side of the equation are countries like Mali and Burkina, some of these smaller markets. Well, Burkina specifically has had a lot of cases, so it's a little bit more tricky there. But Mali, on the other hand, that's basically functioning as normal. So there's a whole range of outcomes, but I think some governments have taken it more serious than others, and the impact is starting to be felt quite seriously on the retailers, and most specifically on the formal retail. The informal retail, I think, is slightly less impacted in some markets. Although in Nigeria, you're seeing the closure of a lot of things. Markets, traditional markets, closing at 4 p.m. Versus in Ivory Coast where things go up until 7, 8, 9 p.m. So, in summary, the impact is starting to be felt, but we haven't seen the most difficult time, and I think the next 2 to 3 weeks are going to be even more difficult than before.
Okay, and Wambi, you're based in Nairobi, and where are you in terms of is it similar things that you're experiencing, like what Sheikh just said?
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. It does sound like we're experiencing the same thing. So in Nairobi, in Kenya generally, we've got a curfew about the 15th of March that started from 7 o'clock. That only left out essential services to be able to operate after. And essential was basically healthcare and supermarkets, just so that there's food continuously flowing. As of Monday this week, we have containment in some towns where the positives have been found, specifically Nairobi and the coastal region. So things are really beginning to slow down across the entire market.
Okay, I guess we're all globally in the same boat for once. Yep, that's globalization. COVID-19 is probably more globalist than we thought. Yeah, unfortunately. Hooman, in that sort of, I would assume you've never been in that space before. So what are the strategies that you think could be used or can be used to preserve the landlord-tenant relationship? And the reason I'm asking this is very often, historically, the landlord-tenant relationship, you need two to tango, as we say, but very often the synchronization was never good. There was always tension between landlord and tenants. And since we're all in the same boat, what strategies do you believe could be used to preserve that relationship and maybe reinforce that relationship going forward?
Thanks, Kevin. So from our side, we've actually generally had good relationships with our tenants because we have more of a family-run operation. So we've tried to stay away from the commercial attitude of both of us sitting on separate sides, which often leads to that tension that you mentioned. The first thing we did was acknowledge the fact that it's a highly sensitive time. There's a lot of information and a lot of misinformation, and we understand that our tenants are reacting to this. So right away, some of them, as soon as we heard of the first case in Kenya about mid-March, some of the retailers wanted to close and they wanted to send their staff home. And rather than resist and fight that, our response was do what you feel is necessary for your staff. Take the time and because we didn't have the right answer, or we didn't know what the answer should be. So we allowed them effectively to calm their emotional concerns immediately. And then we've actually seen a number of them who did close initially now come back and reopen, set up their online presence, and continue to trade for 3 to 4 hours from their retail location. So on one hand, it was giving them the comfort and giving them the assurance that we have their back, rather than confronting them with a sense of, no, you have to abide by what the regulations are. And the second thing we did was started as much as possible to encourage and create an environment of security and safety within the mall. So we operate a mall called the Village Market in Nairobi, which is one of the largest in East Africa, 250, 260 stores. And so we had to give that level of comfort first to our tenants on what were the precautions that we were taking. And we see that the tenants and retailers on their own have started to take the same level of precautions, with temperature tests and sanitizers, handing out gloves, insisting that masks be worn before they enter shops. So they are taking it seriously as of the last, I would say, week to 10 days now, maybe 2 weeks now, yeah.
And on that note, did you, the last month or so, did you put out your all your rental agreements to have a look, what clauses or force majeure that provides for what we're currently going through, or are currently all your agreements still in the closet?
No, of course we pulled them out and reviewed them as we do regularly. But I think our reaction and our response to the tenants, because there were a lot of questions coming about, what's my status, what's my situation, what are the expectations. Our immediate response was that right now we are reviewing everything. There's also some level of support that's expected from the government and from the banks, but those have not been finalized. So as and when those come in, we can then also give clearer guidance. The guidance for now is that these are being considered and looked at. So it bought a bit of time on both sides, but it also gave an assurance that we're not saying clause 17.1 states clearly you have to do this.
That's fantastic to hear. So the lawyers haven't been called in. So I think that's very positive to hear. Wambi, I mean, you obviously represent a lot of tenants. The Tenants Association in East Africa and Kenya. What are your thoughts? I mean, in terms of what's happening on your side, and what are the tenants, retailers telling you?
So if I go back to when the curfew came into play, of course, the expectation of the tenants was that there would be a discussion with their landlords in regard to what do we do about the rent, what do we do about service charge. There were various proposals put forward by the tenants themselves directly to their landlords. One was, can we get a rent freeze? Two, can we get at least 50% waiver on service charges? And to your point of the relationship between the tenants and the landlords, there seems to have been silence from those requests, even though a lot of them, I think, had been put in writing. So as an association, we actually reached out to some of the malls to ask them, really, can you come to the table and discuss with your tenants? Because even post this period, we will need each other. So we need to find a solution that works for both parties. I know we've been trying to get the government to say something about it, but as late as yesterday in a meeting with the government, they keep saying, we've talked to the banks and the banks have given some concessions in terms of lowering the rates. We expect anyone who has a financial obligation to go into the bank and renegotiate, and they are of the stand still that a lease agreement is between two parties. So even as we hope the government will say something, we are continuously appealing to the landlords to come to the table. I've had a few concessions, the people who've been told they can pay 50% service charge. But at the same time, in spite of the situation I've had of landlords who've said, before we speak, you must pay up by 31st of March. And as Holman said, there are people who closed on the 15th. So if you closed already, that means you've actually had no sales. I know a mall that has told people you can come in, we'll do turnover rent, but you must be open. But being open also kind of defeats the purpose because there's hardly anyone going into a mall. And as you said earlier, people walk into a mall, go to the supermarket and walk right out. So the rest of retail that is considered non-essential is having little or no sales since the 15th of March. So it's a discussion that must be held. because we will come out of this, I believe. We don't know when, but we will come out of it. And when we come out of it, we will need, the mall will need to feel the mall owner will need the tenants, and the tenants will need the mall owner because they'll still need the space. So we need to find a solution to tide us over this period.
Thanks. Sheikh, obviously you've got a fantastic mall in Yopougon, which you opened, I would assume, 1.5 years, if I'm not mistaken, around 15 or 14,000 square meters. From a investor stroke landlord perspective, are you in a mindset already in terms of, as Wendy mentioned, rental discount or payment holidays, etc.? Where are you currently?
Yeah, look, the point today, and that's what we told our team, and we're telling our team, in every action that everybody makes that represents the mall, is there is a tomorrow. There's a life after COVID-19. So whatever you do, whether it's thinking about cost cutting, this, that, and the other, remember that there's going to be a post-COVID-19 world. It's not going to be the end of us. And I think that trickles down in the way we approach the discussion and the relationship with the tenants. So when there was the outbreak, the first thing we did was basically to take some measure to ensure the safety of the mall staff, our staff, the employees of the retailers that are in the mall, and the various people that are coming, visitors. And we had a lot of kind of communication and discussions, bringing experts, etc., internally. And I think that created a bit of a sense of trust, I'd say, in this period. And I think that was the basis that kind of is leading us to kind of the discussions we're having now. And of course, quite a few of them have approached us, and the strategy we decided to take is basically not deal with the broader group. We're basically having bilateral discussions, listening to what all the tenants have to say. So it's a lot of tenants, right? We have 50 tenants. I'm sure Roman has a lot more in his mall, so it might be a little bit trickier to basically listen to everybody. But I think that before we got into that discussion was helpful, and trying to educate the tenants to the fact that, okay, well, let's not yet talk about what we're going to do on the rent. It's a difficult period, but and I know that for the mall to work in the long term, we have to take care of it. There are certain charges that don't go away, and us as a landlord cannot bear the full responsibility. So we have to do it together. And so the discussion was more of on a case-by-case basis, right? Because some tenants are open and trading really well. So there's no questions, no issues, whether it's the grocers, the services, the clinics, etc. The ones that are trading halfway, it's a little bit of a trickier discussion because they're open, there's little footfall, etc. So on a case-by-case basis, we see what we do, and then there's the ones that are closed. So we haven't put a gun to everybody's head yet on the payment of Q2 rents because there's little visibility. So we're not even in a position, to say what we're going to do, because part of the bottom line that's going to inform how we treat this is whether the government and the banks are going to support these retailers by programs. I mean, you see across the globe, there's various programs where it's, in the US, the CARES Act, in the UK, etc. There's different programs that help the retailers basically get funding to fund their fixed costs. So, to the extent that there's none of these measures that are in place, well, it will inform an approach from us. And then to the extent that there's some of these measures that are put in place over the next couple of weeks and months, then that also will change the discussion. So basically, we've punted the hard discussion, but we've had this bilateral discussion with people and tried to recoup what we can without yet putting too much pressure on the ones that are closed.
Thanks, Sheikh. Julian, I mean, you did a fantastic presentation with the 2 slides. Great info about the positives and negatives out of that COVID-19 as we speak. You've got visibility on multiple markets from data collection, be it whether it's East or West Africa. The question for you that I've got is, the world is going through a very difficult time as we speak. We're seeing countries going into recession globally, impacting GDP, impacting, you've mentioned, net disposable income of consumers, because people are losing their jobs, or they have to basically dig into their savings. Companies, some companies might be at the verge of bankruptcies, etc. Do you see this as a potential re-rating of rental levels and valuation, and maybe a rebase of rental levels going forward? Or is it too soon to say?
I think it's probably a bit too soon to say, but what's likely to happen, well, first is nobody really knows what's going to happen, but the crisis is likely to last much longer than everybody expects. And when you look at some projections done by leading firms, there's some firms are saying, the lockdown will stay until the month, and depending on the countries, obviously, but until the month of June or July, for example, in Europe. And then what can happen is actually different periods of lockdown in the next 18 months to cope with the different, with the virus coming back, right? So, if this is the case, and maybe that's more on the dramatic side, and we all hope for better situations in Africa at least, but if this is the case, this will definitely have long-term impacts on rents, on a lot of topics, right? Where, if the economy collapses by 30%, let's say, definitely this will have impact on rents and a lot of other factors, right? So I think, again, it's too early to say, but if all the firms and probably the participants here, if you manage a business today, you need to build the scenarios, different scenarios, and maybe one of the worst case scenarios is a scenario where the impact is strong and is over a long-term period.
Okay. The question is, obviously, when the world slows down, whether there will be an impact in terms of investment into Africa. And I'm going to go back to Sheikh, because your investors are based globally. Is the appetite still there for more developments? I assume you have probably a number of schemes, that you've been planning to unlock new developments, Sheikh. What's the status currently? Are you freezing these developments? Are you rethinking or rejigging, maybe relooking at how you're going to implement future developments?
Actually, no, quite the contrary. We are very supportive investors, and so far, who knows what's going to happen over the next 2 to 3 months, but from where we stand now, the appetite is still there. The fundamentals, I think, of our markets are still, strong in the medium to long term. The short term, might be disastrous in some cases, but the fundamentals of the target market that we have, which is middle to lower middle income, not the largest, but kind of the neighborhood community type centers where your exposure is mostly to essential, I think bodes actually very well to what we're doing. And in this COVID crisis, I think one of the impact is going to be an acceleration of the formalization of retail, both from the bottoms up and the top down, because people now more than ever start to understand the need to be in safer and healthier environment to shop. So, we're going forward. We had one project specifically where, we were haggling around land prices, and, over the last 2 weeks, it's kind of unlocked. So I think it's gonna be great for investors and developers that have access to capital and the willingness to go in, because, they're going to be able to get deal done at, to what you're saying, maybe more reasonable and normalized level, with a view that, no matter what happens, by the time you come out with your scheme in 18 to 24 months, we would have learned to cope with COVID-19 one way or the other. It might be something else at that point in time, but in 24 months' time, I suspect, we're not going to be talking about COVID-19 every 5 minutes. And so coming out at that point in time with a new scheme in some of these markets, I think the fundamentals will be there. But then, what's happening globally with investors and their allocations, as things go worse, then maybe that will change kind of the commitments they've made to us. But so far, they're supporting and encouraging us to keep going.
Sheikh, if I may, you talked about a point which is around a safe environment in your mall or malls. We've seen, historically, for example, in a number of countries or cities in Africa where unfortunately, we had to deal with terrorism, and the malls had to adapt, in terms of security getting in terms of the flow of clients in and out, etc. And I recall, I think, Human, who basically mentioned earlier on about sanitization and health safety. Do you see any long-term restructuring on how you're going to, apply that sort of health safety, social distancing, maybe, less crowded in the food court areas, etc. Keeping distances when you get to the checkout of the supermarkets or the stores. Are you thinking about this as well, that it might be a more medium to long-term impact as opposed to just a quick short-term 3-month impact?
No, you're 100%. I mean, the world will never be the same across the board. I think for all of us, and for us as a shopping center, things change. So because of the crisis, we've had to have these electronic thermometers to take people's temperatures at the doors. But I think from a more permanent basis, what's going to happen is what you see in the airports with the cameras that control people's temperatures. So I think these things will become more permanent features of what you'll see at the entrances of shopping centers. So to the extent that you have outbreaks, you'll be able to get into kind of this crisis mode. And from all of us, basically now we're forced to think about how do we react in terms of crisis, from a health crisis. One of the biggest risks we run today is looting, right? Because as you do these confinements, as we have a poor population, people that go out and $1 or $2 every day, to the extent that we have a long period of time where the economy is dragging and people can't get food, the one place they know they'll have food is coming to the shopping center, right? So even our security apparatus, how we think about how we secure the mall at night, the measures, the drills as to, if you have a mob of 50 people that get on the parking, what you do, etc. All these things are going to become kind of routine and the everyday kind of operation, whereas before it probably wasn't as prevalent. So yeah, it's going to evolve for sure and become more permanent.
Human, moving on to you. My question is around the future of online retail. Obviously, as the owner of malls, you've got a set number of tenants in your market, for example. Are you already seeing a number of your tenants who basically migrating to online? And do you fear that some of them might migrate 100% online, or they might have both a physical presence in your mall, but also have online as well on the side? And then you as a landlord, how do you adapt to that in terms of future tenanting, in terms of size of shop? Would you be looking at potentially reducing size of shop, knowing that some might go online?
Thanks, Kevin. And I'm going to speak up a bit because I think my volume was down. So if it sounds like I'm screaming, let me know.
Not the way you used to do it to your tenants, yeah.
Okay. So it's a good question. I mean, we made a decision a few years ago, 3-4 years ago, to do a major expansion. We doubled the size of the mall, even in the face of understanding that the online and on that.
How big is the mall?
The mall's about 650,000 square foot of retail. So about 260 tenants now, and it sits on a 14-acre site, and it's also anchored by 2 hotels that we operate ourselves. So so it's a complex in itself, but we were aware that retail in Africa is moving in the digital direction, the online direction. But still, notwithstanding, with the new section that we opened, and we opened it 2 years ago, we're sitting at 97% let. And what we found is generally many of those retailers have an online presence, both from a marketing perspective and a trading perspective, but there's still a level of comfort, especially when you're talking about buying things like foods, jewelry, some elements of clothing, that people prefer to come into the store. And so they'll do their browsing at night and see what's available, and then make a decision based on that to go into the shopping center.
And on that note, when we talk about online shopping, is there a fear that small tenants might be crowded out of that space, or do you think even smaller tenants have got far more opportunities to go online?
I think the smaller ones have a lot of opportunity to go online. We've seen, because of the existence of Facebook and WhatsApp, a lot of the small retailers, especially in jewelry and fashion, have a physical presence, and then they have an online presence. To agree with Homan, I think I'm of the opinion that we will not run out of brick and mortar retail. I do not think that brick and mortar is in competition with the e-commerce element. I think they will complement each other. And I like to take some comfort in the fact that Amazon has now gotten a brick and mortar outlet. So I think the two will complement each other. I think the smaller ones will probably grow more on their online platforms, meaning that the property manager might lose out some of those in that sector of jewelry and fashion. But on groceries and things that people like to touch and feel, that will still remain in brick and mortar significantly. And I wanted to add 2 comments to what Cheki was saying about whether there's going to be change in light of the current measures that we're putting in place in terms of safety and security. You do know, they say it takes 21 days to change a habit. COVID is going to be on for more than 21 days. So in our particular environment, I always feel we didn't have, and I think maybe it's an African thing, we were not very awake to personal space, so we do crowd places. But COVID will, within the next few days, teach us that we do not need to crowd. So the behavioral change will probably mean the safety measures that have been put will remain the norm. It won't be the abnormal, it will now become the norm and the normal, so maybe they will stay. The same thing with security. I think security will be maybe more about, yes, the continuous existence of the threat of terrorism, but also just general lookout. I think just for the comfort of people. The reason people go to shop, to Julian's presentation, more in modern trade has a lot to do with that safety, both in terms of security and health. So I think those will remain constant. They will become the new normal.
And on that note, Julian, a year ago at the API conferences, be it whether it was East in Kenya or Joburg or Lagos, there was one theme that was coming up every time, which was basically the death of big super malls.
Yes.
And the growth of convenience centers. The question I've got for you is, in this crisis, we've seen, for example, and Sheikh mentioned that, people panic and they all run towards the big centers, which creates even more issues in terms of further contamination and not respecting social distancing, etc. Do you think, we'll see convenience centers or even last mile distribution, for example, where petrol stations could become the last mile in the chain, where people wouldn't need to drive 10Ks or 5Ks to go shopping? Do you see that as an opportunity there?
Yeah, you see this, yes, absolutely. And this is not linked to the COVID situation, right? We see in Africa, in terms of trends, and regarding malls is two things. We see big malls such as the one from Human, where these malls are becoming more of leisure spaces where people go, they spend time, they eat out, they can do plenty of leisures, and they do a bit of shopping as well. And that definitely, there's some room for a few of these in each city. But in parallel of this, we see a huge development of more of the convenience and smaller malls. So I don't know if the one from Czech fits into that, but probably, right, where we see a huge demand for malls which are smaller, closer to where people live. Keep in mind, that the car penetration is still quite tiny in most of the African countries. So, people want to shop. They want, as Sheikh was saying earlier, they want to shop in a more modern and serene environment, but that environment needs to be next to them, right? So we see a bit both in a few large malls which are more, which have a lot of dining out space, a lot of leisure, etc. And then we see smaller neighborhood and convenience related shopping areas that will also develop. I think with the COVID-19 situation, what we see, and I don't have yet the data for Kenya, but if I have it, I will share it with you. But what we see in other countries is outside of Africa that the convenience retail had much higher growth than larger malls, right? The reason for that is because of the situation of the lockdown. People actually didn't want to travel too much for shopping, and they didn't want to go to crowded places, so they tend to go the closest to where they live. And so what we see is that typically you mentioned the petrol station stores, the smaller neighborhood modern supermarkets had a much higher rate of increase of sales than the larger supermarkets.
And I'm going to stay with you, Julian, because on one of your slides, you talked about the impact, and one of the impact is on discretionary spending. And I'm wondering here, people are going back to basics, i.e., survival, which is food, more basic stuff, basically. Do you think, in the future, for example, things like distribution of supermarkets, in various parts of Africa, in the towns and the villages, etc., would be more important, and whether people would potentially move their discretionary spending, or maybe less discretionary spending, back to the basic stuff?
Well, yes, probably. Then the fact is that on the African continent, most of the expenditures today are on food. So if you look at the retail all across the continent, the bulk of the spending is on food. And food, meaning fresh food, but also groceries and so on. And so probably the fact that the discretionary spending will decline will impact less on the African market, just because that pool is smaller anyway, right? So I don't think over the long term, as Sheikh was saying, I don't see any issue in the development of convenience retail, of modern supermarket, etc., because most of the markets are still underdeveloped, and the trend is bringing the supermarket closer to where the lower middle class population is, so that they can have access to modern retail. That trend is not going to change. Then to your question on discretionary spending, it's a bit again too early to say, but I see the impact. The impact will be long lasting. If you take, for example, travel, and if you look a bit at what's happening, is the airlines, the travel company, they don't expect any return to the normal before 12 to 18 months, right? Mm-hmm. The reason for that is because they foresee that when the situation will be back to normal, people won't start traveling all over the world. They will start putting their life into order, probably, and then making sure they have the basic needs, making sure then it's safe also to travel before traveling. So if you look at travel, the impact is probably going to last at least a year, right? And I think on other discretionary spending, the impact could be shorter because they're not the same as travel, but yet the impact is probably going to last for a bit of time.
Okay, great. I know we've gone in 50 minutes in our panel discussion. We've got an hour. There are lots of questions that are coming from our viewers and I'm going to try to pick as many as I can in the next 10 minutes. Sheikh, a question to you is, your future developments, are you going to reconsider or relook at your traditional tenant mix? You know, are you going to sit down with your architects and say, things have changed and we're going to do things differently from a tenant mix perspective?
Well, I mean, as Julian was saying, I think the current crisis doesn't change our initial view of the world. I think the way I look at it is not necessarily big versus small. I think there's a question around the dominance of a mall within a catchment and the competitive landscape, right? And the scarcity factor. I think that's one thing to consider. So you're still going to have some very large shopping centers because of the fact that, you know, for structural reasons, they're going to be the only ones in that area. And then you have a captive catchment, and they have an offering that I think caters to the experience, you know, whether it's leisure, food, the setup, the outdoor, the fact that it's mixed use development. Then from that perspective, I think these are not going to go away, right? I think where you get chipped a little bit is on the mix and the exposure to fashion, accessories, and, you know, to some extent beauty, where that's where I think the competition to the informal sector and the online retail is very strong, right? And so in the mix that we have, you know, as at the moment, for example, amid kind of this emergency situation, 40% of our stores are still open, right? In numbers, not even in GLA. And that's because of the mix, because, you know, we have a lot of services. You have the restaurants with the food courts, the grocers, clinics, and things like that. So, you know, as we go forward, probably about 60% of our tenants are going to be, you know, in the resilient, in the first share of wallets, right? So, you know, things that people need to spend money on, right? And then the remaining 40 is where you have a mix where, you know, you have a bit of the beauty, the accessories, the fashion, the electronics, etc., etc. So, you know, as far as we're concerned, basically, we view that there's going to continue to have a transition from informal to formal, right? And basically, within the catchment where you're going, you need to match what people right now spend their first, you know, 80 cents on the dollar on. That's what you need to be able to put on your mall. And I think that's why, you know, even if we have a downturn, you know, that 60% of our tenants are going to be okay. So it's not really changing our approach from that perspective. I think it's comforting it.
I think if I may, Kevin, just one note
sure.
on building on this is, you know, I see probably fashion struggling quite a bit in the coming months, right? Because typically in such a crisis, on beauty, as Sheikh mentioned, people might not spend immediately, but they will still spend a bit of beauty, you know, so that for their well-being, they feel good, etc. On equipment, household equipment, also, if people stay more at home, they might be buying a bit more of equipment or making sure it works, etc. I think on fashion, typically it's the category where you don't want to spend on fashion. You don't really care how you dress if you're staying home. And so this, for me, especially in the short and mid-term, fashion might be a bit of a concern.
And on that, Julian, and I'm going to pass that to Wambui. Do you think there are cultural differences on our continent that people might say fashion is more important than something else?
I don't think so.
I don't think so. Yeah, okay, I don't think so. Sorry, Wambui.
I don't think so. I don't think so either. And as Cheke said, what seems to move a lot, I think everyone across the board has actually said that, even on this panel. Our greatest mover are mainly food because of the level of our economies. So fashion is maybe a distant third out of the things even fourth or fifth out of the things we need to do right now in terms of the general population. So fashion will definitely suffer in this time, definitely will suffer. Yeah. And if we look at our local retail here in Nairobi, those were the first people to close. those within the malls and those outside the malls. Those were the first people to close.
Okay.
And I'm sure Homan can bear me witness that the greatest appeal in terms of rent actually probably came out of the fashion group.
Yeah, that was certainly a challenge that came up initially, and they were affected first of all, and things like recreation as well, partly because of the sense of social distancing. So we run a number of recreation trampoline parks and kids play areas and bowling, and as much as there was still a little bit of demand for that, we made the decision to close it because of a sense of responsibility, and certainly a drop in revenue with the guidance on distancing. But going back to your earlier point, Kevin, I also wanted to talk about this when you talk about the design of the malls. I think one thing, and Cheka was talking about it, Sheikh was talking about it momentarily, was this idea of risk when you come into the mall: security, terrorism, and health risk. I think more and more we're going to see an airport-like experience where, as you enter these places, especially the larger malls, you will go through a health and security check, and then be unleashed into kind of your retail playground, where you're safe within that space. We're seeing that happen now. I mean, we've imported 15 infrared scanners for each of our entrances in the shopping center, so that in parallel with the a metallic scanner, which is a security scanner, we now have
Yep.
a health temperature scanner, and so you go through both, one after another, and we did that early on, realizing that that's one of the front line, one of the responses that we could put in place, just like you do against security threats.
And that's a very good point. I guess we tend to forget how the world tends to be before and after a crisis. Before 9/11, going through airport, and after 9/11, security check is totally different. But now it's the norm. We take it as the norm, basically, to almost be, getting almost naked, if I can put it this way, going through security. And I think it's a very interesting point that you've made in terms of how that's going to impact the malls. The other question I had for you is, in many countries, and we've seen in developed countries, in first world, the health sector collapsing, not sufficient hospitals, not sufficient confinement, mediclinics, or whatever you want to call it, etc. Do you think, because malls, be it whether it's big malls or smaller malls, convenience malls, are located in suburbs, do you think there's something there to play with by providing probably confinement space to government in the future, or some kind of mediclinic in the future? Do you think that's something you might look at, Human? Because obviously you've got one of the big malls, 65,000 square meter, is big, including the two hotels. Do you see that health component being part of your future redesign or extension or expansion?
So we were lucky in that we had some resources in play already for that, and then we looking, as I think Julian said, we had maybe 2 months or 1 month head start, in terms of just being behind the rest of the world. So we had some time to react. So one, we do have a hospital in the center. We have a branch of one of the larger hospitals, and it's set up more as a VIP hospital. So they had services set up, and were ready to treat both COVID patients, but we haven't had that many cases. It's really been more government-led. So it was more about becoming a center to treat other types of services and requirements around health and medicine. So they've been very busy, and they've also kept them all quite busy in terms of footfall. The other side of it was that the one of the hotels was selected as a quarantine facility. So we had 150 rooms taken up about 2 weeks ago as a quarantine facility, and luckily none of the guests in the hotel actually were tested positive. They did maintain the protocols all the way through, and were allowed to go home. I think the last guest will be leaving today, but that also made a very big difference in terms of sustaining business for at least one of the hotels. And we're now looking at options for one, if not both of the hotels to serve either as continued quarantine facilities or as isolation facilities, where we can take maybe people who are at higher risk, either through the government or as a commercial, private element. People who are at higher risk can actually stay in what we call a safe environment, where we've tested everybody coming in, and we know that if you're worried about your parents or you're worried about somebody who's not well, that they can be in a safer environment.
Okay, great. Sheikh, there's the question around, obviously, because you're based in West Africa, you also look at Anglophone Africa, Nigeria including. There's a question around Nigeria. We all know over the years, land prices have been extremely high, super expensive, cost of construction high. But then we see a country that's basically that has been impacted the last couple of years, and more so now with the drop of oil price. The net effect of that is people have got less net disposable income, which might be a longer structural perspective than a market like Kenya, for example. What are your views about Nigeria? Do you see a re-rating of asset prices, land, construction costs? And do you see leases going down, lease cost? And the big question, which has always been the elephant in the room for years, is dollar leases. Is that still sustainable?
Listen, as my partner always says, in Nigeria, there's always a come to Jesus moment. And I think, this is probably it. When you're going to combine the impact of the oil crash and COVID, it's likely going to be a wake up and a real awakening for, some landowners and the developers and the retailers. And with all of this, I think the first thing is, how the currency is going to be impacted. It's almost guaranteed that there's going to be a depreciation, right? So the question is, how much is going to be depreciated by, and how is the government going to be able to control that and limit uncertainty and limit panic and keep some forex so that retailers can function. So it's going to be a difficult time. And I think what it will do, it will force developers to rethink the model, because part of the reason why the rent is so high is because historically developers, I don't think, have been very efficient in the way they develop the assets, right? So for new developments that will come up, people will have to sharpen their pencils, because this rent normalization, wherever that ends up being, whether it's still dollar contracts or in local currency, it had already started, and it's likely, I think, to probably come down a bit more, which means that to make your returns, international investors will have to sharpen their pencils, change the model, and be a lot more efficient. Which also means that there's going to be a huge opportunity for developers that have access to local capital and are able to get local debt and charge and have Naira prices. I think these will end up being centers that will have a competitive advantage. So for people that are able to access the local capital, then it will change the game. But I think it will just be very tough in general for the international investors. And I don't think there is any questions that rents will come down. The real question is by how much. But at the end of the day, Nigeria has 200 million people, 180 million people. These people have basic needs. So the trend from informal to formal cannot be reversed. So it will happen. The only question is, how is that going to be? Who are going to be maybe the winners there? Are you going to see a lot more of the local developer and investors winning? And what's going to happen to the existing stock of people that have developed, for too expensive? So there's going to be a haircut, and some of these investors will probably lose some money.
Yeah. And I guess maybe for next time, because we're almost at the end, basically, would need to wrap up. I think we could have spent another half an hour, but we'll have to wrap up. But maybe, Julian, would love to have some statistics, to compare with what happened in Japan, for example, in the 90s, with the depression in Japan and revaluation of assets downwards, and disposable of income, etc., and have some comparison with what we might or might not be going through. But overall, I think from what I've heard from you is you're still positive. First of all, you're still alive, which is a great news, and healthy, which is great. We're still positive about the continent. We're still positive about investments to be done. Both Sheikh and Uman, you've talked about further investment in the future. You've talked about the marriage between online and brick and mortar. So it's not competition; it's actually synergies between the two. Wambi, you talked about the relationship between tenants and landlords. I guess the word that comes in mind in these crisis period, and I would also include the bankers there and the funders and whatnot, is solidarity. So we're all in the same boat. Somebody mentioned that earlier on. So I think it's only fair to share the pain across the value chain rather than to push it on either the consumer or the landlord or the tenant solely. The other thing as well, which was mentioned, is around disposable income. In the short term, we're going to have impact on people's purchasing power. That I would assume is not only Africa, it's globally also as well. I guess before we wrap up, would like, sort of 20 seconds from each, your sort of closing note would be, what kind of message would you pass on basically to the viewers and to people out there, starting with Sheikh?
As my message is, there's going to be a world after COVID. People now have to find a way to kind of ride the wave and survive. But I think people, we shouldn't be too pessimistic. We should be careful, take care of ourselves, safety of the environment that we're in, whether it's as a landlord for the workers or our tenants or the people that come in. I think that's the first part, and I think people will remember that. So how we behave in this era will have an impact on how we'll be able to do business going forward, because people won't forget how they were treated within this period. So I think it's a time for people to kind of come together, be understanding, while also preserving interest from whether it's their investors or the various stakeholders. But there's going to be a future after this, and I think net, when we look back at this in 3 to 4 years time, I think Africa in general will probably come out stronger and better from this.
Great. I think that was a message to the lawyers and the bankers. They also need to be part of that solidarity club. Wambi, what are your thoughts? Your final thoughts?
To ride on Sheikh's words, I think it's time to change that relationship, because it's a partnership. It's not you versus us, and this is a good time to relook at that. It's also a time for retailers to start looking into a relationship with their consumers. In Kenya, I always say we collect a lot of data, but we don't use that data to understand our shoppers. And using that data will help us grow into this e-commerce era more effectively. I think it's a time to innovate new ideas on how to reach your customers so that you're able to grow into the future post COVID. And for Africa, I think import substitution comes into play now. It's an opportunity to find out how do we grow our own industries based on what we import. Maybe it's a time to look into all the things that we are bringing in from Asia, from the Americas, and what out of that stuff can we actually do here so that we grow our own industries and build on it's called Africa Continental Free Trade Area.
I totally agree.
This is our time. Yeah,
I totally agree on that. I think on another panel or another session, it's something which we should put as on the agenda. Even countries within Europe are even going for localization. And I think it's a great opportunity for us to basically eat, consume, and back made in Africa products in our malls. Hooman, I mean, you've heard the call from Wambi, and I know you started saying that you are a family run, you've got good relationship with your tenants. The call is to enhance that relationship. What are your final thoughts, Hooman?
I think on all levels, it's going to be, I've heard people refer to it as a reset, a hard reset. I think that's where the opportunity is, that, you know, sometimes there's a lot of clutter, there's a lot of, you know, whether it's retailers, companies, organizations that just have been trading in quite an inefficient manner. So I think this will clear a lot of that up. It will create efficiency when we come out of it. And that hard reset will allow us to actually be more competitive as markets and individual organizations, and more efficient moving forward. So we can actually bring in, I think one of the, going back to Amboi's point, one of the issues is that Africa typically hasn't been able to be competitive or efficient against markets and products from places like China and Europe. So, you know, being able to get back into your core and your roots as an organization and see how you're going to not survive, but actually blossom when we come out of this, that's going to be very interesting.
Absolutely. And I think we've got a continent that's always been able to rise against far more difficult things. So bring it on, as they say, isn't it? Julian, your final remarks?
No, a quick word. So I fully agree with what has been said on the opportunities for the continent, and also the opportunity to reduce, you know, probably some of the China dependence, you know, for a lot of these countries. We've seen that already, right? I was reading today, you know, some Kenyan companies, you know, manufacturing masks, where almost overnight they went to from producing garment to producing masks in a high number, etc. So I think this is a great opportunity. I think beyond this, I think, you know, we are still in the, you know, in the shock phase, right, where we still don't know all of the impact, and I think the impact are probably be stronger, not necessarily in a negative terms, right, but there will be plenty of opportunities where, you know, for the world and especially the retail world to change, right, and so as Hooman mentioned, you know, some guys will disappear, they will be replaced by other guys who will maybe sell, you know, products which are not today on the market. And so, you know, there will be, I believe there will be a lot of impact, and the consumer will change. They will come to the mall, as it was mentioned. They will expect more of maybe an airport-like experience, and so this will change. People will want distance, and this will not disappear overnight. I don't think so, right? So this will impact. I think the impact will be strong and over a long period of time.
Fantastic, and great to have you all on that panel. Like I said, you know, we could have carried on for another half an hour to an hour. There are lots of questions that still coming through, but I think these can be taken to on future webinars. And my closing note would be safe, you know, stay safe, be healthy, and I think it's a great opportunity for us as Africans basically to back ourselves, and I know we're not sponsored by anybody here. I would love to say, you know, Ethiopian Airline is doing a great job by distributing masks and equipment along the continent, and I'm seeing small entrepreneurs actually in Senegal mushrooming up and doing masks basically, and we're going to be seeing those masks very soon on the shelves. So it's a great opportunity for us basically to rise to the occasion. So let's be positive, and we'll fight COVID-19 together. And I'll leave it to Kafir to close the webinar. Kafir, it's all yours.
Thank you, Kevin. And thank you to our panel, Julian, Wambui, Hooman, and Sheikh. Thank you so much. I think it was a great discussion. And yeah, a lot of positivity as well, which is great to see during this period. So thank you to our moderator, Kevin. Thank you to our panelists. My key takeaway is I think that there's definitely a lot of opportunities, even given how tough the current period is. And I think that came through in the discussion, which is great to see. So on that note, we're going to wrap up today's webinar. Just for our audience that is still around, we are having another webinar next week which will be focused on real estate investment implications across Africa. We've got a confirmed panel including JLL, CDC from the UK, Growthpoint Investec, as well as some others as Standard Bank. So a really strong panel lined up for next week, and the idea is to continue the discussions and really have some positive trends like this discussion from this week. So on that note, I'm going to close up this week's webinar. Once again, thank you to our audience, thank you to our panel, and thank you to our moderator as well.
Kafir, if I just might say one thing, because unfortunately I don't know what happened. The camera couldn't see me. Just to tell the audience, I'm not a robot as of yet. Yeah, I do exist and I'm alive.
Yeah,
okay.
We'll fix that one up. But
take care.
Take care. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Okay.